In the quiet cradle of our world, long before language and memory, the first humans left behind something more enduring than fire or footprints. The delicate shells of their own thoughts, their skulls. Buried beneath shifting sands and silent cave floors, these ancient bone vaults held not only the architecture of early minds, but whispers of a world untouched by history books. Tonight, we peer into those hollows. We listen for the murmurs in marrow, and we follow the gentle path of discovery taken by those who dared to unearth them. With every fragment of fossil and every measured ridge, we step deeper into the memory of humanity itself. And as you drift deeper into this mystery, know that we truly love and care for you. This space is safe, soft, and made for you to rest your mind while feeding your wonder. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. The wind in East Africa is different than elsewhere. It doesn't rush or howl, it whispers. It brushes gently over ochre cliffs and riverbeds, through tall golden grasses and into the mouths of forgotten caves. It carries a kind of ancient memory, as if it remembers more than it should. In this place, time rests lightly on the land. It doesn't feel old, exactly. Not like a crumbling ruin or an abandoned city, but rather timeless. As if age itself is so deeply woven into the soil, it no longer needs to be mentioned aloud. Here, under layers of dust and waiting, a small piece of bone once stirred. Not with movement, not in the way of living things, but with discovery. It was morning when they found it. The light was soft, slanted through the mist, and the air held the smell of dry rock and distant rain. A young archaeologist, or maybe an assistant, the records never quite agree, paused mid-step. There was something unusual in the slope of the ground, a small pale curve catching the light. Not a stone, not a root, something else. Something that had once held thought. He knelt without speaking. Some instincts come from deeper than training. He brushed at it with slow hands, gently, as if waking a sleeping animal, as if afraid it might crumble from the weight of recognition. A fragment of skull, browned with age, fragile as baked paper. Just the dome, the parietal, and a slice of the frontal, but unmistakably human. Or perhaps proto-human. The line between is blurred when you're standing at the edge of time. They measured the site with care. Grid lines drawn, emerged. This skull fragment belonged to Australopithecus afarensis, they would later decide, a distant ancestor of ours who walked upright but still knew the trees, Lucy's kind, but older perhaps, more uncertain. It's strange to think that so much can be known from so little. The thickness of the bone, the slight curve of its surface, these details spoke volumes, not in words, but in patterns, comparisons, probabilities. It wasn't just bone they had found. It was a keyhole. To peer into the skull is to peer into thought, to look upon the earliest architecture of awareness. Imagine, before fire, before speech, before gods and stone tools, this was the shape that held the first flickers of fear, of wonder, of hunger and comfort. A vessel of pure survival, a cradle for the oldest dreams. And yet, it had no name, no language, no monument, only silence. But silence is not the absence of meaning. It was catalogued, gently, wrapped in soft cloth, sent to laboratories cooled by humming machines. It would be scanned, measured, dated. Carbon isotopes, stratigraphy. Every test they could think of, they would try. But no machine could tell them what it had seen. Had this being, man, woman, child, crouched near a stream and watched the light fall in shards through the trees? Had they listened to the breath of an animal nearby and known to be still? Had they heard thunder and felt awe? The skull could not answer, but it suggested. It hinted. It became a mirror for our questions. In the years that followed, more fragments would appear. Teeth, jaws, the curved bowls of other skulls. Together they formed a mosaic of presence, a constellation of early humanities scattered across the African basin, each one with its own silence. We name them now: Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, names given by science, but they had none for themselves. They did not know they were beginnings. They simply lived. We often imagine them as less aware, less kind, less curious, but perhaps that is our pride speaking. A skull is not less for being smaller. It is simply tuned to another rhythm. And so we return, again and again, to those same riverbeds, those same caves. We crouch in the dust. We brush the earth from what remains. We listen. Because what we find there is not just ancient bone. It is memory. Not personal memory, no, but deeper. An ancestral knowing. A shared beginning that connects every one of us. Because within the shape, with noise, not with triumph, but with wonder. And in that quiet moment, time folds softly upon itself. The hollow speaks, and we listen. There is a move forward but down, where history does not stretch into the horizon, but sinks into layers of soil and ash. This is Olduvai Gorge, in the Great Rift Valley of Tanzania. A wound in the earth, deep, dry, sacred. Carved not only by water, but by memory. To walk its floor is to tread upon epochs. Each layer of sediment is a page. Each grain of sand, a letter. Together they write the story of us, though not in language we can speak, only in forms we are still learning how to read. The cliffs rise around you like quiet witnesses. They do not shout. They do not sing. But they keep secrets. Some too large to comprehend, others small enough to cradle in your hand. It was here, in the mid-20th century, that Mary Leakey knelt in the dust and found more than stone. She found presence. In a shallow fold of exposed earth, peeking from a bed of compacted silt, was the arc of a skull. Just a curve at first, a shimmer of bone so weathered by time it had turned the color of dusk. Carefully, with brushes and patience, she revealed it, piece by piece. Not a complete skeleton, no arms or legs, but a partial cranium nearly intact. Something rare, something extraordinary. It was later identified as Homo habilis, handy man, the maker of tools, one of the earliest known species in our own genus, about 1.75 million years old, a number that, even when whispered, stretches the mind so far it feels like looking at the night sky, trying to hold all the stars at once. But this was not just a fossil. It was a whisper, a presence. The skull was not large by our standards, the forehead low, the face forward and primitive. But the brain case was slightly expanded, a subtle shift enough to suggest change, growth, not just physically, but cognitively. The archaeologists who gathered around it did not speak at first. Some discoveries silence you, not out of fear, but out of awe. There's a reverence in knowing you're the first eyes to meet a face after 1,000,000 years of forgetting. They named it OH7, Olduvai hominid number 7, a sterile name. But the skull had more meaning than a label could hold. It was a bridge between ape and human, between instinct and reason, between surviving and remembering. Nearby they found stone tools, chipped flakes, simple, crude, and efficient, the kind that could sharpen sticks in its giving. It does not roar like a river. It hums softly, like breath beneath the surface. The layers here are like time stacked in shelves. The oldest at the bottom. Basalt flows from ancient volcanoes. Above them, beds of ash, sand, and clay, each one marking a shift in climate, in life, in death. You could place your hand against the wall of the gorge and touch 2,000,000 years of presence. And in that silence, you begin to feel your own breath slow. The skull of OH7 now rests in a museum, behind glass, preserved and catalogued. But the real story is still in the dust where it was found, in the place where the sun slants low and the wind carries nothing but itself. We often search for meaning in ruins, in writings, in monuments. But here, in Olduvai, meaning lives in emptiness, in absences, in the way the land folds around what it has lost. Mary Leakey returned to the gorge for years. She mapped its layers, walked its length, followed footprints left by early humans hardened in ash. And each time, she said, it felt like listening to the earth exhale. The skulls found here are not just artifacts. They are reflections. They show us the shape of change, the beginning of thought, the curve of intelligence as it began to stretch its limbs. And yet, what remains unsaid is perhaps the most powerful. Who was this being? Did they live alone? Did they know fire, or only its warmth from afar? Did they cry out in pain, or laugh at the sky? Did they have a mother who mourned when they did not return? We do not know, and still we wonder. That is the gift. Not answers, but questions. Not certainty, but a soft place to begin asking. And in the quiet of Olduvai, beneath the weight of the stars and the hush of dust, the questions are enough. Because sometimes the presence of a skull is not just a reminder of death, but a testament to life. Before fire warmed the world, before its light danced across the stone walls of caves, there was only cold and dark, the long, shivering quiet of nightfall within that light. Something new. The flicker of flame mirrored a flicker inside the mind. Possibility, memory, imagination. The skull had already begun to shift before this moment, the brain slowly growing larger with each generation. As diets changed, tools were made, and cooperation mattered more. But fire accelerated it. Not by magic, but by nourishment, by safety, by time. Because with fire came cooked food, easier to chew, easier to digest. That freed energy, that fed brains, that carved space inside the skull for more than just survival. And so, slowly, skulls changed. They stretched upward. They rounded at the top. They allowed for frontal lobes, the parts of us that imagine, that plan, that dream. What once was merely bone became architecture for the mind. Imagine them, our ancestors, seated around the first fires, their eyes reflecting the glow, their shadows cast long against rock and tree, their skulls still thick and sloped, but their thoughts already reaching forward. Did they feel wonder? Did they stare into the flames and remember the hunt, the danger, the comfort of each other? We'll never know. But the shape of their skulls tells us something did change. That inside those bony lanterns, stories had begun to form. The archaeological record holds clues. Sites where charcoal mingles with bone, where scorched tools lie beside hearths, where ash settles into the cracks of the earth like soft snow. From Zhoukudian in China, to Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, to the Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, the story repeats itself. Fire appeared, and skulls grew. Not in a single leap, not as a sudden spark of genius, but slowly, delicately, like embers catching in dry grass, building warmth in the long dark. We see it in the fossil record. The skulls of Homo erectus were larger than those who came before. Inside them was space for thoughts that lasted longer than a moment. Thoughts that circled back. Thoughts that imagined tomorrow. Fire, in this way, was not just a tool. It was a mirror. It changed how we lived, yes, but it also changed how we thought. And the skull, that quiet vessel, carried it all forward. What began as instinct became memory. What began as mimicry became culture. What began as a flicker became a flame. The skulls that carried fire did not write books. They did not build temples, but they built the foundation for everything that would follow. They made space for wonder. There is something gentle about this thought, that intelligence was not forced, not invented overnight, but kindled, like fire, slowly, repeatedly. Then a casing for the brain. It became a lantern, glowing dimly with memory, warmth, and the quiet ache of becoming. We do not carry fire in our hands anymore, not the way they did. But inside us, within the skulls we each possess, the fire remains. The fire of thought, the fire of fear, the fire of imagination. Tonight, as the lights dim and your room falls into hush, remember that your skull, your own bony lantern, is part of that same story. You are not separate from those early ones gathered by the fire. You are the continuation of their gaze into the dark. Let that comfort you. You are not alone. You never were. There is a narrow valley in western Germany where the earth folds gently between limestone walls. A stream once threaded through it, murmuring past soft moss and dark roots. The birds sang above it, the rain pooled in its quiet bends, and beneath its floor, hidden in sediment and time, bones rested, waiting for someone to remember. In the year 1856, quarrymen broke open a stretch of rock while mining for lime. What they uncovered was not stone, but bone, heavy, pale, and strangely shaped. A skull, thick-browed and long, unlike anything they'd seen before. It was found in the Neander Valley, and so the name was given, Neanderthal. Though, in truth, the being had never named itself. It had lived and died and been buried in silence, long before such names mattered. At first, they did not understand what they had found. The skull's shape was unsettling. The brow ridges were pronounced, the eye sockets deep, the jaw strong and almost defiant. It looked human, but not. Some said it was a soldier, warped by disease or madness. A Cossack, perhaps, deformed in battle and buried in haste. Others whispered stranger things, stories of lost races, of brutish ancestors best left forgotten. Because sometimes, the past frightens us more than the future does. But slowly, with care and patience, science began to see the truth. This was not a monster, not a mistake, but another kind of human, a cousin, Homo neanderthalensis. They lived in Europe and parts of Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, longer than modern humans have yet existed. Their skulls were different, yes, but they held just as much mind, sometimes more. Larger brain cases, robust frames, heavy jaws, but also culture. They made tools, crafted spears, wore clothing suited to the cold, hunted in groups, cared for their injured, and, perhaps most haunting of all, buried their dead. In places like La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France and Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Neanderthal skeletons have been found curled in shallow grave lights. Diagrams compared its features to ours, marking its strangeness with arrows and labels. But labels can lie when spoken too loudly. Because when you sit in the quiet with a Neanderthal skull, when you run your eyes over the curve of the cranium, the ridge of the brow, you feel something deeper. Not distance, but kinship. Their faces were broad, yes, their features heavy. But inside that bone was a mind that mourned, that laughed, perhaps, that feared the dark and found comfort in firelight. They sang, maybe not as we do, but in rhythm and breath. They made art, or symbols that tried to become art. In caves across Spain, red pigment dots and handprints have been dated back to Neanderthal hands, long before we arrived. And so the shadow of Neander is not a shadow of lesser light, but a shadow cast beside ours, equal, silent, fading only because we survived and they did not. The reasons for their disappearance are still debated. Climate change, competition, interbreeding, perhaps even violence. But their skulls remain, in vaults and drawers, in photographs and molds. And sometimes, when we map the human genome, we find traces of them in ourselves, Neanderthal DNA, echoing in our cells like distant music. You may carry it. You may be their shadow. Their presence lingers not just in fossils, but in faces, in strong jaws, in thick hair, in the way your body responds to cold. They are not gone. They are remembered. And in remembering them, we begin to see how quickly misunderstanding can become myth. How easy it is to call something mad when we do not understand it. How quickly different becomes less. But madness, too, is just a form of mystery we haven't yet learned how to honor. The Neanderthal skull is no longer feared. It is studied, respected. Some artists have even sculpted their faces, not monstrous, but human, with eyes full of weather and tenderness. Tonight, in the quiet of your room, imagine that valley in Germany. Imagine the stream, now dried, the trees leaning in with their quiet leaves, and below, in the hush of the soil, the shape of a skull, once touched by rain, now touched by light. A skull not of a stranger, but of a relative, a being who dreamed, perhaps, as you do now. Let that thought settle gently beside you. We are not the only ones who carried stories beneath our brows. There are places in the world where silence feels deeper, where it pools in corners like water, where it presses against the skin, not with weight, but with memory. The Chauvet Caves, hidden beneath the forgotten stars, but presence of something deeper, something sacred, something quiet. And there, among the paintings, nestled in small alcoves and hollows, are skulls, placed, not dropped, set with care, oriented toward entrances or toward walls, sometimes resting on flat stones, sometimes encircled by marks in the earth. One, a cave bear skull, was found resting on a rock slab, perfectly centered, undisturbed for over 30,000 years. What does it mean to place a skull? Not to bury it, not to hide it, but to position it, as if arranging a thought, as if making a gesture to the darkness and saying, "This mattered." The humans who came to these caves, early Homo sapiens, modern in body but mythic in mind, understood something we've only begun to remember: that bone is not waste, it is memory. That skulls, especially, carry not just life's end, but life's echo. They brought firelight into the caves. They painted by flickering torch. They walked for hours beneath the ground, winding through narrow passageways and cathedral-like chambers. And always, they left things behind. Not trash, but offerings. In Grotte de Cusack, human remains were laid beside engravings. In Punikel Cave, a ring of broken stalagmites was built, deep underground, with fire marks and animal bones nearby. In El Castillo in Spain, handprints and red discs surround niches where bones may have once been placed. This was not mere survival. This was ritual. This was memory made physical. We do not know their language. No words survive. But their arrangement of space speaks. The placement of skulls is not random. It is deliberate. And in that deliberation, we find intention. And in intention, we find meaning. Imagine them, walking silently through the dark, guided by torchlight and scent, holding the skull of an animal or a person, turning it in their hands, not with fear, but with reverence, finding the perfect hollow, the perfect ledge, setting it down, stepping back, listening. Because the cave did not just hold the bones, it breathed them in. The acoustics of Chauvet and Lascaux are striking. Clap your hands, and the sound echoes in patterns. Speak, and your voice multiplies. Perhaps they sang there. Perhaps they whispered names. Perhaps the skulls were not the end of something, but the beginning of something else. A dialogue with the dark. Some archaeologists say these were burial sites. Others suggest places of teaching or initiation. Some think they were sanctuaries. Others stages.
Something when we see it. Not fear, not science. Something older. A recognition. Because long before we had books, we had bones. Long before we carved names into stone, we carved meaning into placement, into gesture, into the quiet setting of a skull on a slab and the slow backing away into darkness. Skulls, after all, are not just containers of thought. They are symbols of presence, of mortality, of identity. And when arranged, when curated, they become more than memory. They become story. In Dolní Věstonice, in the Czech Republic, a triple burial includes a central figure whose head rests between the pelvises of two others. Skulls and bones painted with red ochre, placed in patterns. Not chaos. Choreography. These people lived 20,000, 30,000, even 40,000 years ago. And yet they grieved. They honored. They remembered. They created meaning in the silence that follows death. We look at their skulls today in climate-controlled museums. We scan them, 3D print them, digitally reconstruct their faces. But none of our technology captures the why behind that placement in the cave. Why place a skull beside a painting? Why return, year after year, to arrange bones in darkness? Because memory, for them, was not written. It was ritualized. And perhaps they understood what we forget. That death is not the end of presence. That a skull, carefully placed, becomes a bridge between life and whatever follows, between breath and stillness. Tonight, in the hush of your room, let yourself wander to that cave. Let your imagination follow the torchlit path down into the quiet. Feel the cool stone beneath your fingertips. Hear your footsteps echo against ancient walls. And see, ahead of you, the soft curve of a skull resting on a flat stone, as if it has always belonged there. Because maybe it has. And maybe, if you sit quietly enough, the cave will breathe around you. Not in words, but in memory. Water has always been a patient sculptor. It carves canyons, softens stone, carries mountains grain by grain to the sea. And in its quiet erosion, it sometimes leaves behind more than sediment. It leaves behind faces. Across the vast stretches of earth, in Turkana, Dmanisi, Java, ancient riverbeds have become museums without walls.
Rudolfensis, Homo ergaster, bearing the early architecture of memory and breath. Their skulls are wide, long and varied, no single shape, no singular line of descent, instead a braid. Thick strands crossing and uncrossing, growing stronger in their weave. At Dmanisi in Georgia, far from Africa's heart, 5 skulls emerged from beneath a hill, all from the same time, all slightly different. As if evolution had paused there, experimenting. As if 5 faces could carry 5 paths forward. One had no teeth, yet lived long past losing them, suggesting compassion. Another had an odd mix of ancient and advanced features. Strong jaw, rounded brain case, narrow face. Each skull spoke a dialect of human becoming. We once believed the path to us was a straight one, a steady climb from primitive to modern. But the riverbeds tell a different story. At Java in Indonesia, a thick-browed skull with a sloped forehead was found near a riverbank. Homo erectus, yes, but different again. A regional variant, a traveler. Proof that our ancestors were not static beings, but migrants, crossing seas, testing climates, adjusting with the wind. And as they wandered, their skulls adapted. Heat shaped them one way, cold shaped them another. The availability of food changed jaw size. The demands of survival sculpted cheekbones. They were not all the same, and they didn't need to be, because humanity was never meant to be one thread. We were, and are, many braids. The fossil record shows this. Not a ladder, but a river delta. Tributaries flowing side by side, some drying up, others surging forward, occasionally merging. And the skulls, found in riverbeds or washed from cliffside tombs, are our map. Each one is a face, a story not told in words, but in curves and cavities, in the width of a nasal bridge, in the slope of a frontal bone, in the depth of an eye socket that once scanned the horizon, alert from movement, scent, light. They were not you, but they were not strangers either. They were near enough to share our genes, far enough to leave behind puzzles. The riverbeds that held them became time vaults, safes locked not with keys, but with sediment and silence. Until storms came, until erosion peeled away the layers, until eyes trained to look for ghosts saw, instead, ancestors. And still today, new skulls are found. In Ethiopia, in China, in Spain. Each one with a face unfamiliar and yet eerily close. We want to see ourselves in them. And sometimes we do. Other times we don't. And that, too, is beautiful. Because evolution in the breeze. But below, in the dust and clay, a skull rests still. Not buried, but held. Held by the earth, held by time. A face without name, a presence without monument. And yet, remembered, simply because we found them and paused long enough to wonder. Let that be your lullaby tonight, that even the forgotten, even the broken, even the buried can be found again. When we picture our beginnings, we attempted to imagine a single figure, one lone ancestor standing against the dawn, lifting their eyes to the sky, breathing in the first taste of consciousness. But the truth is softer, stranger, more beautiful. We did not descend from one, we emerged from many. From Homo habilis, with its clever hands, from Homo erectus, with its endless stride, from Australopithecus, half tree, half earth, still learning the language of uprightness. Each left behind skulls, not tombstones, but signposts, curved and cracked and filled once with the flicker of becoming. If you placed them side by side, these ancestral skulls, you would not see a smooth evolution. You would see a collage, a conversation, a tangle of brow ridges and jawlines, of brain pans that swelled and then narrowed again. Some rounded, some long, some with teeth worn down from years of chewing roots or cracking nuts beneath open skies. This was not a neat staircase. It was a forest. Each path twisted, crossed, diverged. And in that forest, the skulls speak not of progress, but of presence. The skull of Australopithecus afarensis, known best through Lucy, is small and low, the forehead sloping sharply backward, the face projecting forward. She walked upright, yes, but her skull still echoed the forest. Her world was one of trees and predators, where every sound mattered and every shadow could mean danger. Then comes Homo habilis, handy man. Its skull still small, but beginning to curve at the top. The brain a little larger, the jaw a little lighter. Found in East Africa near simple stone tools, its very name is an act of hope, that hands and minds grew together. But alongside habilis, in overlapping time and place, stood Homo rudolfensis, its skull wider, face flatter, brain perhaps larger. Cousin, competitor, or simply another note in the song of becoming. Then Homo erectus, tall and long-limbed, walks onto the scene. Its skull shows a leap, not toward beauty, but toward endurance. Thick-boned, with a strong brow and a Floresiensis, the hobbit of Indonesia, with a skull tiny and yet full of mystery. How did it get there? How did it shrink? How did it survive? Each skull is not an answer. It is a question. And together they form a chorus. When we trace our lineage, we no longer point to a straight line. We see a river system with branches and streams, some drying, some joining, some lost. And through those currents, the skull floats, carrying the shape of thought across time. Even the modern skull, yours, mine, is not pure. It is blended, mixed with Neanderthal, with Denisovan. Echoes of migration, of union, of shared fires and shared fates. To say we have one father, one mother is poetry, but to look at our skulls is to know we are the children of 1,000 experiments, each one carried forward in bone. You can see it in the details, the widening of the frontal lobe across species, the gradual loss of the heavy chewing muscles, the shrinking of the face as the brain expanded. Each adjustment a whisper, more room for thought, more room for light. Even the way skulls are shaped by life, by trauma, by nutrition, by birth, reminds us that no two are alike, and yet all carry the same echo: to survive, to remember, to grow. In museums around the world, these skulls rest quietly in glass, their names typed on neat placards, their measurements recorded. But outside the glass, in the still hours of the night, they remain alive in memory. They are not relics, they are relatives. And in a way, they are also teachers. They remind us that the self is not a singular invention. It is a gathering of instincts and choices, of jawlines from far-off valleys, of brow shapes sculpted by ice, by hunger, by laughter we'll never hear. They remind us that humanity did not begin with a moment, but with a weaving. Each skull a thread, each silence a note. And tonight, as you lie in the hush of your room, feel the gentle curve of your own skull against the pillow. Know that it carries more than your thoughts. It carries history. It carries voices you've never heard, languages you'll never learn, dreams you've inherited without knowing. You are not descended from one. You are held up by many. A chorus of ancestors. A cathedral of bone. And in that quiet architecture, you are home. High on the slopes of Mount Katsika, in the northern folds of Greece, there is a cave carved not by human hands, but by water and time. It is called Petrolona, and for most of history it sat in silence, a hollow breath in the mountain's side, its mouth hidden by rockfall and the slow march of centuries. Inside, cradle, like a memory refusing to fade. For thousands of generations it watched nothing, yet it remained, quiet, patient. It was found in 1960, quite by accident, by a shepherd-turned-explorer who followed a draft of wind into a crack in the hillside. Inside, he discovered not treasure, not tools, but presence, the unmistakable curve of bone where no bone should be. A human skull, but not quite. The features were unusual. The brow was heavy, pronounced, the face wide, the brain case large, almost modern, but not entirely. It was a blend of traits, a mixture of ancient and familiar. They named it the Petrolona skull. Some called it Arcanthropus europaeus petroloniensis, an early European man. Others argued it was Neanderthal. Still others said it belonged to Homo heidelbergensis, a distant ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. The truth is, no one agrees. And perhaps that's the point. Because the skull at Petrolona speaks not with certainty, but with ambiguity. The kind that lives in long silences and deep time. What matters more than labels is this. It was there, watching, waiting. Moss grew around its eye sockets. Water dripped beside it in the darkness. Bats nested overhead. Centuries passed. Empires rose and crumbled not far from where it lay. Stone temples were built, statues erected, ships launched from Grecian shores. And all the while, the skull remained in its bed of limestone, unnamed. It had not been buried. It had not been discarded. It had been placed. Some researchers believe the body was carried into the cave by animals or water. But others, looking at its position, at the shaping of the chamber, suggest a more intentional act. That someone, once, laid it there. As tribute, as ritual, as remembrance. We may never know, but the cave remembers. Stalagmites grew taller around it, time's candles burning upward. The minerals in the air turned the skull a reddish hue, giving it a warmth that bone does not usually have. It looks less like a relic and more like an ember, glowing softly in the dark. And still, it whispers. Not in words, but in questions. Who was this being? Did they know fear? Did they love? Did they see firelight dance across the cave ceiling, as we do now in our dreams? Their skull tells us little in specifics. No artifacts were found nearby. No tools, no artwork. Just bone and silence. But that silence, mix of traits, reminds us that evolution was never clean. It was messy. It was beautiful. It was blended. And the skull at Petrolona, resting half in shadow, half in light, reminds us that some ancestors do not fit our lines. They stand between. They wait between. They belong to both. In this way, Petrolona is not just a cave. It is a threshold, a place where time folded inward, where the living placed their memory, where a skull became more than evidence. It became witness. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let the world grow quiet, picture that chamber, the stone, the hush, the weight of the mountain above, and in its center, a skull, still watching, still whole, still whispering the same soft truth it's whispered for 200,000 years. I was here. I mattered. I waited. And now, you remember. In a dusty limestone cliff on the edge of the South African town of Tong, something small once lay cradled in the rock. Not hidden exactly, just unnoticed. A face, smooth and fine. Eyes wide, all where eyes once had been. A soft curve to the forehead. A jaw not yet finished. It was the face of a child. The year was 1924. The bones were discovered by quarrymen breaking stone, carting it off by the wagon. Among the rubble, a strange rock with a strange expression was pulled from the debris and passed along to a professor named Raymond Dart. Inside that stone, partly encased, partly revealed, was the fossilized skull of a young being, not ape, not modern human, but something between. Dart looked and saw history, but the world looked and saw a child, and they doubted. It was too small, too rounded, too graceful, they said. Not primitive enough, not strong-jawed or thick-browed, like the fossils found in Europe. This was not what early humanity was supposed to look like. They called it insignificant. But significance, like love, rarely shouts. The Taung child, as it came to be known, was about 3 years old when it died, perhaps by a predator, perhaps by accident. Its skull was preserved with rare perfection, the baby teeth intact, the eye sockets deep and curious. And behind those eyes, nestled in the stone, a tiny brain case that held just enough space for wonder. Dart declared it belonged to a new species. It. That meant the child stood upright. It walked. It carried things. It looked at the world with 2 feet on the ground and eyes set forward, like we do. The brain was not large, but it was enough for choice, enough for touch, enough for some quiet understanding of warmth, of safety, of fear. And there was something else, a tenderness. The skull is delicate, almost fragile. The bone thin, the features small and fine. It reminds us that the journey to humanity was not only marked by strength or tools, but also by growth, by the vulnerability of the young. Because every great story starts with a child. And this child, for all its dismissal, never disappeared. Years later, as more fossils were found across Africa, in Sterkfontein, in Makapansgat, in Ethiopia, the puzzle pieces began to shift. And suddenly, the face that had once been forgotten began to glow, not as an afterthought, but as a first note. Today, the Taung child is seen not as a mistake, but as a milestone, a turning point in how we understand where we come from, a reminder that the beginnings of our species are not marked only by fire or violence or invention, but by smallness, by softness, by transition. We often look to the past for heroes, for kings and warriors and inventors, but sometimes the deepest wisdom lies in a child's skull no larger than your palm. It tells us that walking upright began early, that brain growth came slowly, that childhood itself, the lengthening of dependency, of learning time, was part of what made us human. Because to grow slowly is to be held, to be taught, to be loved. And so, this tiny skull in stone teaches us about connection. That every grown mind once rested inside a fragile head. That every ancestor, no matter how bold or strong, was once a child, dependent, learning, becoming. The Taung child does not look fierce, but in its quiet, it endured. It endured skepticism. It endured erasure. It endured the long silence of misunderstanding, and still it speaks. And what it says is simple. I mattered. I stood. I was seen. Let that be enough. Tonight, as you rest your own head, a skull full of stories, memories, questions, remember that you too were once small, and someone, once, protected your soft places, carried you, waited for you to grow. The child from Taung never had that chance, but even in stone, it waits no longer. It has been remembered. Bone is not soft like skin. It does not wrinkle with age or flush with emotion. It does not tremble with laughter or tighten with fear. And yet, it remembers depth of the eye sockets, the width of a jaw. Inside these forms we find memory, not of a specific moment, but of patterns, of habits, of lives lived. Anthropologists do not only study bones for size, they trace the delicate traces of life left behind, the healed fractures of a fall, the worn grooves of a habitual gesture, the minute differences between those who chewed raw roots and those who boiled food in clay. And in the skull, more than anywhere else, we find the blueprint of identity. Every brow ridge once shielded eyes that blinked and squinted and searched. Every zygomatic arch, the cheekbone, framed a face that smiled or frowned or simply rested in the hush of evening. Some skulls bear marks of illness, pitting along the inside, signs of iron deficiency or infection. Some carry the scars of violence, cracks that healed or didn't. Others are quiet, smooth, still. But even the quiet skulls hold memory, because beneath the surface, the brain case, the hollow where the mind once lived, tells us how much space there was for thought, for coordination, for imagination. In Neanderthal skulls, the occipital region is broad, suggesting heightened vision. In Homo sapiens, the frontal lobes expand, allowing for planning, social nuance, the whisper of a future self. These are not just measurements, they are echoes. The skull is not passive, it is shaped by the life it once carried. The brain pushes outward as it grows. The bone forms around it, cradles it, protects it, and in doing so, takes on its memory. In this way, bone becomes a sculpture of the invisible. We map emotion in calcium. We chart behavior in the slope of the nasal cavity, in the angle of the mandible. A forward jaw suggests different speech. A high palate, different diet. Subtle variations, thousands of them, build the profile of a vanished person. And as we compare skulls from across time, from distant geographies, we begin to see the story of humanity unfold, not as a narrative, but as a gesture drawn in bone, a widening here, a shrinking there. Every adaptation a soft reply to a changing world. The cold sharpens the face, the tropics broaden it. Long journeys thin the skull walls, while thick diets toughen the jaw. And so, across the globe, humanity became a gallery of faces, each one a variation on the same theme: to remember, to adapt, to continue. And yet, in every skull, no matter the time, no matter the place, we find the same unyielding truth, this once held thought. Someone lived inside this. They woke, they feared, they learned, they forgot. They watched the sun through trees. The skull was not just bone to be discarded. It was respected. It was recognition. Even when language was not yet born, early humans seemed to know. This is where the self lived. This is where presence once rested. This is what remains when the soul is gone. Some traditions carried skulls from generation to generation. Ancestor skulls, family skulls. They were not relics, but companions. In Papua New Guinea, certain tribes once displayed the skulls of the departed in homes, adorned with clay and pigment, set among daily life, so the memory never faded completely. In medieval Europe, saints' skulls were enshrined in gold, kissed, carried in processions. In Mexico, the calavera, the skull, became a symbol of joyful remembrance, not fear. Even today, we turn to skulls in art, in metaphor, in reflection. We use them, not to frighten, but to remind that we are not eternal, that we carry others within us, that memory, real memory, is not just made of thoughts, but of structure, of shape. And the skull is shape refined by life. Tonight, as you rest your head and feel the pillow cradle your own skull, take a moment to remember. This bone is not just protection. It is history. Yours. The world's. Inside its gentle hollows and firm ridges lies the record of every emotion, every instinct, every adaptation your ancestors made to keep you here. You are a continuation. Your skull, unique, delicate, quietly strong, carries the echo of every mother who survived, every father who ran, every child who learned to speak. And that is something worth sleeping beside. Let it comfort you. The soul may pass, but the skull, the bone, remembers. Onta. The skull is often imagined as a single piece, a shell, a helmet, a singular cradle for the mind. But that is only how it ends. In the beginning, the skull is many, a constellation of plates, soft, separate, drifting gently together in the warm tide of infancy. And where those plates meet, they do not join in haste. They meet in lines, delicate seams known as sutures. Each suture is a story of birth, of breath, of pressure and promise. If you've ever cradled a newborn's head, you felt them. The subtle ridges, the tender gaps, the fontanelles, soft spots that pulse faintly with life, like second heartbeats. These sutures are nature's accommodation. They allow the skull to flex, to ears. They mark where once we were open, where once we were becoming. The major ones have names. Coronal, like a crown, where the frontal bone meets the parietals. Sagittal, running like a quiet road from front to back. Lambdoid, at the base, shaped like a soft Greek letter. Each with its own rhythm, each closing on its own time. And within their delicate architecture, they hold more than structure. They hold memory. Because these lines are not just anatomical, they are emotional landscapes. In them, we read the lullabies of long-ago mothers, rocking their children in the dusk. We read the patience of growth, the way a child slowly learns the shape of the world. We read the vulnerability of beginnings. In the fossil record, sutures speak with surprising volume. A skull with open sutures is young, perhaps just begun. A skull with fused seams tells of age, of completion, of stories nearly finished. And those that close too soon or too late speak of hardship, of trauma, of struggle, of a body adjusting to burdens we may never know. Some ancient skulls show signs of cranial modification, deliberate shaping, boards tied across a baby's head to mold the skull into a chosen form. The status, the beauty, for belonging. And even then, the sutures adapted. They curved with care. They found new ways to hold together. This resilience is what defines them. They do not resist pressure. They do not break in protest. They bend. They yield. And still, they hold. We often think of strength as rigidity, but the skull teaches something else. It teaches that softness is a strategy, but flexibility is not weakness but survival. Because the mind needs space, and the soul too must grow. The sutures offer that space, then close, quietly when the time is right. Some skulls, buried for millennia, still show these lines with delicate clarity. Even fossilized, they tell us how old a child was, how fast they grew, whether they had been well or ill, whether they had time to become. And some show interruption, broken seams, fractured lines, a blow, a fall, a sickness. And we pause because even the bones we study can still make us ache. And so, the sutures become more than anatomical detail. They become reminders that all of us began incomplete, that all of us were once held together by softness, that the self was once not a fortress, but a garden in bloom. Tonight, as you lie back and feel the weight of your head ease into the pillow, think of your own sutures, invisible now, quiet, but still there. Think of how your skull once opened for growth, then closed.
When we think of a skull, we often picture the outside, the brow, the jaw, the teeth grinning in silence,
the mask of bone we leave behind. But the true story lies not in the face we once showed the world, but in the hollow within, the space carved out for thought. The cranium is not simply a container, it is a cradle, a quiet shell formed to fit a sleeping mind. It holds no thoughts of its own, yet its shape is molded by every breath the brain has ever taken. The folds and curves of the bone rise gently to mirror the pressures and pulses of neural growth. And within that soft chamber, over millions of years, something incredible happened. The slow bloom of thought, not all at once, not suddenly, but gradually, like a flower responding to light it didn't know it needed. The earliest skulls, Australopithecus habilis, have crania that are low and narrow, with thick bone and modest capacity. Enough to survive, enough to sense danger, track food, care for kin. But then, quietly, steadily, the space grew. With Homo erectus, we see the dome begin to rise, the sides round, the brain expands toward the front. This was not just more space, it was different space. Space for memory, the planning, for the seeds of imagination. Inside these crania, the first whispers of language may have stirred, the first dreams, the first fears, not of predators, but of the unknown, of death, of love, of firelight fading. The inside of the skull holds no photographs, no texts, but it holds shape, and shape remembers what thought has asked of it. Anthropologists study these inner surfaces with reverence. They scan them with light. They create endocasts, digital or physical molds of the space the brain once filled. And in those echoes, they read the story of minds we will never meet. The ridges show where brain tissue pressed against bone. The indentations map blood flow, temperature, stress. The tilt of the cranium reveals posture, balance, intention. A single groove tells us where vision dominated, another where touch and movement took hold. And in the front, the rise of the prefrontal cortex tells a silent tale of self-awareness. It is here, in this frontal bloom, that empathy was born, that foresight took root, that the mind first bent around the question, what if? The face may lie, but the cranium tells the truth. It tells us who could imagine, who could teach, who could bury their dead not out of instinct, but grief. In this way, skulls are not just relics. They are testimonies, not to what someone looked like, but to how they thought. It is humbling to consider how the mind sculpts its own house. The more we think, the more we change. Even now, the skulls of modern children show slight differences from those of 1,000 years ago. Decisions. It shelters the softest part of who we are. It carries the brain not like a box, but like a bowl, open, curved again, as if always ready to hold a little more. Even in fossil form, these bowls of bone hold us in awe. Some are broken, cracked, warped by time, but the interior tells the story still, that someone lived here, that someone thought here, that this space was once full of electricity and silence, of warmth and longing, of choices. Tonight, as you lie quietly, feel the back of your head touch the pillow. Beneath your hair, beneath the skin, beneath even your dreams, is your own cradle. It has held you since before you could remember, and it will hold you still. You are carried, and before you others were carried too, across millennia, across continents, across language and loss. We may never see their faces, but we know their craniums, and through them, we know their minds. In this way, the skull, silent and still, speaks the richest tale. The tale of becoming, the tale of thought, blooming in the dark. Somewhere in a quiet valley, beneath an ice age sky, a young human stood still at the edge of firelight, eyes open, breath shallow, looking not at what was there, the trees, the night, the glowing coals, but at something else, something inward, something unseen. This is where dreaming began. Not the sleep dreams of animals, stirred by scent or hunger, but waking dreams, the kind that shape symbols, that tell stories, that imagine futures and speak to the unseen dead. And we know this shift not by tools alone, not by art or burial or song, but by the place that held those thoughts, the skull. By the time Homo sapiens emerged, around 300,000 years ago, the skull had changed. It had grown not just larger, but rounder. The forehead lifted, the back of the cranium curved gently outward. The shape, no longer sloped and angled, now echoed a quiet readiness, as if it had begun to accommodate something more. Inside that space, the prefrontal cortex expanded, the seat of reflection, of social awareness, of long memory. With it came capacity not just for survival, but for symbolism, for fear shaped into myth, for love shaped into song, for grief carved into stone. The shape of imagination left its mark in the shell that held it. You can see it in the skulls from Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, from School and Kafsa in Israel, from Cro-Magnon in France. The modern human skull had emerged, not ident to explain, to carry something forward. The ochre handprints in Chauvet and Sulawesi are not mere markings. They are echoes of minds trying to remain in the world, even after the body goes, to remain in the dream. And dreams, once seeded, grow wild. They carved beads from bone. They arranged burials with care. They sang, though no recording remains. They told stories around firelight, stories that survived not in words, but in how the skull began to change. Because the brain that dreams pushes outward. It presses on bone. It makes space, and the skull listens. In Blombos Cave, beads made from snail shells date back 75,000 years. Not for warmth, not for use, but for beauty, for meaning. In Barakat Ram, a small stone figurine, shaped perhaps into a female form, may be one of the oldest pieces of sculpture. Not functional, but symbolic. This was the mark of dreaming. And the skull, the rounded, high-domed skull of Homo sapiens, became its cradle. Compare it to the skulls of earlier species, to Neanderthal, Erectus, Habilis. They too had minds, but the shape of imagination, the balance of brain regions, the subtleties of volume, suggests something began to bloom uniquely in us. Not better, not superior, just different. We began to live in two worlds, the world outside and the world within. And in the shape of our skulls, that division shows. We made room for language, not just speech, for rhythm, not just sound, for memory that stretched beyond a single lifetime. We became storytellers, and the skull, once only protector, became witness. It held not just thoughts, but belief. Not just instinct, but wonder. It held questions too large for the mouth to speak. And still, it held them. What did they dream, those first minds? Perhaps of animals that spoke, of ancestors who returned in wind and bird and storm, of children yet to come, of shapes drawn in dust that meant the sky, of the moon as a watcher, the stars as fire's siblings. We do not know, but we feel it, because we are still dreaming. The skulls we carry now, you, me, everyone, are shaped by those first inner landscapes. Our crania echo theirs. Our minds still reach through that same vaulted chamber for meaning. You are not apart from them. You are a continuation of dreaming. Tonight, as you fall into your own quiet dark, let that thought guide you. That long ago, a mind not unlike yours imagined something more than what was, and the scar.
Tonight, we follow those skulls. Not as artifacts, but as travelers. Not as relics, but as companions carrying with them the shape of thought and the imprint of endurance. Across continents, they left behind their echoes. In Dmanisi, Georgia, the first glimpse of humans stepping beyond Africa. Skulls with small faces, large teeth, a mix of ancient and modern. They were not tourists, they were survivors, moving with the seasons, watching stars not yet named. In India, fragments of Homo erectus skulls were found beneath layers of ash and river mud, whispering of lives lived beside monsoons, near jungles. The bone was the same, yet shaped by new climates, new tools, new fears. In China, at sites like Zhoukoudian, the skulls of Peking man, thick-browed, low-domed, speak of long stays in caves, of fire used with purpose, of winters endured. A lineage adapted to the chill of the north. And in Indonesia, the skulls of Homo erectus emerged again, but changed. Narrower faces, longer limbs, the traces of island life. And later, the tiny skulls of Homo floresiensis, found on Flores, so small they seemed like myth. Hobbit people, some said, yet real and enduring. Across the ancient map, skulls appear like constellations, each one marking a path. And as sea levels rose and fell, as coastlines shifted, they moved again. To Australia, over 60,000 years ago, where Homo sapiens arrived by raft or by land bridge, their skulls shaped by salt wind and sun. They left behind not just tools and ochre, but burials. Skulls placed with ceremony, with shells, with songlines etched into stone. These were not random scatterings. These were intentions. Journeys made with knowledge, with courage, with memory pressed behind the forehead and carried over tides. The skulls that traveled seas were not just passengers. They were blueprints. They held the instructions for speech, for fire, for story. And with each generation, they adjusted. In Europe, skulls adapted to cold. In island tropics, they shrank or lengthened, depending on need. In deserts, they endured dehydration. In forests, they listened more than they shouted. Bone does not resist the world, it responds. And in that response, we find history. Some skulls carry signs of trauma, broken jaws healed badly, puncture wounds that tell of accidents or conflict.
Others are worn smooth, as if old age to the wind in a language we will never learn. And their skulls, quiet, enduring, carried it all.
Even today, modern human skulls reflect this movement. We are not copies of a single shape. We are a mosaic, high-cheeked and broad-jawed, round-headed and long-skulled. Our diversity is not a deviation, it is a record of tides crossed, of mountains climbed, of languages lost and reborn, of nights slept beneath new stars. You may be resting now in a room far from where your ancestors began, but the skull you carry holds the memory of movement. You are not still, not entirely. Your blood has traveled oceans. Your thoughts rest in a vessel that was once carved by salt and time. Let that bring comfort tonight. The skulls that traveled seas are not strangers. They are the reason we exist, and they are still traveling, not across lands now, but across generations. One head resting against another, one mind becoming another. A long chain of migration that leads, gently, to you.
There came a time, long after the first tools, after fire, after wandering, when humans did something new. They stopped at death. They looked at the body, still, silent, and they chose not to turn away. They bent low. They arranged the limbs, and they touched the skull as if it still meant something. This was not fear, this was belief. The skull, once simply a vessel of thought, a shelter for the brain, became something more. It became sacred. Across the earth, in caves and graves, in riverbanks and mountain tombs, skulls were not discarded. They were honored. They were cleaned, painted, placed with care. And in doing so, humans declared something softly profound. This is not just a thing that was. This is a presence that remains. In Jericho, over 9,000 years ago, skulls were found beneath the floors of ancient homes, carefully buried, then later retrieved, plastered with clay to restore the faces. Shells were set into the eye sockets, features sculpted with loving hands. These were not decorations. They were memories made solid, ancestors brought back into the living space, not as ghosts, but as guides. In Nataruk, Kenya, even earlier, though without clay or plaster, bodies were laid in fetal positions, their skulls facing west. Some carried wounds, some wore beads. And even in the violence of their deaths, their skulls were treated with an eerie symmetry. It was as if the hollow of the head, the space that once held a person's entire world, could not be abandoned, not completely. Burial itself is a form of belief, not in doctrine but in presence, in the idea that the body means more than just biology, that the skull, especially, is not merely bone, it is a relic of the self. In Çatalhöyük, one of the world's oldest cities, skulls were sometimes buried beneath platforms where the living slept, a head beneath a bed, not hidden, connected, a reminder, a comfort,
Some skulls were found alone, detached from their bodies, yet never discarded, carried, arranged, kept. Across the Near East and parts of Europe, these skulls appear in sacred spaces, not as trophies, but as keepers of story. And in other places, skulls were painted. Red ochre, the color of blood, of earth, of ritual, was rubbed into their grooves. It stained the sutures, it clung to the orbital bones, it turned the past into something vivid, something breathing. Even in Papua New Guinea, in traditions that survived into modern times, ancestors' skulls were displayed within the home. Eyes sealed with clay, faces reconstructed. They were not mourned as lost. They were invited to stay, to listen, to witness, to bless. The skull became a shrine not to death, but to continuity, to something that lingered. Perhaps that is why we still feel a hush when we see one today, in a museum, in a photo, even in art or poetry. The hollow eyes, the closed jaw, the echo of something unfinished. It is not fear, it is recognition. The belief that lives in skulls is not always religious. Sometimes it is simply human, a desire to keep someone near, even after their body has gone still. A belief that who we are is not erased when we fall silent. And the skull, that quiet vessel, offers just enough shape to hold that hope. It is the part of us most unchanged by time. Hair grays, skin fades, muscle falls, but the skull remains familiar, personal. And in its permanence, belief takes root. In some graves, skulls were arranged in circles. In others, they were elevated above the rest of the bones. Some were surrounded by beads, others by pigments. Each placement a sentence in a language we no longer speak, but still feel. What did they believe, those early humans? That the dead watched? That they guided crops, protected homes, guarded dreams? Or simply that remembering was a form of reverence? We do not know. But the evidence is there, in the gentle polish of a skull held too often to be accidental, in the worn base where fingers touched, in the hollow script clean not by decay, but by care. These skulls were not lost things, they were held things. Tonight, as you rest, imagine your own head, warm, alive, filled with thought, resting where thousands of other heads once rested, on soil, on stone, on mats woven from grass. Your skull is part of a lineage of belief, not in gods necessarily, but in connection, in memory, in presence. The hollow that holds your thoughts now may one day be empty, but that emptiness too can be sacred, because it once held you, and that in itself is worthy of reverence. Not all skulls tell the truth. Some are shaped not by time but by desire. And sometimes in our hunger to understand ourselves, we listen too quickly. We see what we long to see. The story of Piltdown Man is not just a scientific hoax.
It's human, still prone to myth, still vulnerable to the stories we wish were true. It began in 1912, in the quiet fields of Sussex, England. A man named Charles Dawson, an amateur archaeologist with a flair for finding the remarkable, announced a discovery from a gravel pit in Piltdown. Fragments of a skull and jawbone. They seemed strange. The skull was rounded, high-domed, very human. But the jaw, long, heavy, primitive, looked more like an ape's. Together they seemed to bridge a gap the world had been desperate to fill. A missing link. At the time, the idea of human evolution was still young, raw, contested, politicized. The fossil record was thin. Most early human remains had been found in Africa or Asia, and Britain, proud and rooted in empire, had yet to find its ancestor. Piltdown Man, Eoanthropus dawsoni, as it was hastily named, offered that ancestor. A noble British origin, a brain-first evolution. A skull that supported what many already believed, that intellect had come first, and from Europe. It was comforting, too comforting. For decades, the fossil was treated with reverence. It was displayed, sketched, cited. Textbooks wove it into the timeline. Museums granted it place and pedestal. And anyone who questioned its authenticity was met with resistance. Not always scientific, but emotional. Because Piltdown wasn't just a skull, it was a story. And stories, even false ones, are hard to let go. But truth is patient. And science, when honest, has a way of self-correcting. As the years passed, more skulls emerged. In Africa, in Asia, in Europe. Real ones, consistent ones. Homo erectus, Australopithecus, Neanderthal. Their skulls told a different tale. That humanity did not begin with a big brain and European dignity, but with slow, branching changes across continents. And the more these real skulls were studied, the more Piltdown began to look odd. In the 1940s, new techniques arrived. Fluorine dating, chemical analysis. And when they were applied to the Piltdown fossils, the truth came whispering through the dust. The skull and the jaw were not the same age. The teeth had been filed, the bones stained to appear ancient. It was a forgery. The jaw came from an orangutan, the skull from a medieval human, placed together, shaped to fit a story, not the earth. And just like that, the illusion crumbled. The science that almost lied did not lie on its own. It was helped by those who
Erased truth. It only delayed it. And in its undoing, we were reminded that even in the search for ourselves, humility matters. That the skulls we uncover are not there to flatter us. They are there to teach us. And we must be quiet enough, honest enough, to hear them properly. Tonight, as you close your eyes, think of that gravel pit in Sussex. Think of the hands that planted a lie. Think of the minds that believed it. And think, too, of the truth, waiting, deeper in the earth, untouched, unbothered. Because truth does not vanish. It rests. It breathes through bone. It waits to be found again. In the end, science is not about perfection. It is about returning to the evidence, to the questions, to the bones that do not lie. And so we return, always, to the skulls, to the dust, to the quiet shape of who we are becoming. The morning had begun like any other. In kitchens, bread was rising. In courtyards, children were playing with carved ivory dice. At the edges of streets, merchants haggled softly over figs and wine. The people of Herculaneum and Pompeii had no reason to fear the mountain that stood in the distance, Vesuvius, quiet and sleeping, draped in green. But beneath that stillness, something was stirring. And when it woke, it did not roar. It did not give time to run. It rose with fire and thunder and smoke, a curtain of death falling over the day. The eruption of 79 CE lasted only hours, but in that short time, it wrapped the world in ash. Heat poured into streets, roofs collapsed. The sky went black at noon, and then silence. But under that silence, something remained. Skulls, buried in hardened ash, sealed like soft thoughts turned to stone. Some were found curled beneath stairwells. Others clutched the bones of children. In Herculaneum, over 300 skeletons were discovered huddled in boathouses near the sea, waiting for rescue that never came. Their skulls leaned toward the water, toward hope. Some of them were infants, some were mothers, some wore jewelry, some held tools. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary final moments. And their skulls, fragile, heat-split, frozen, became diaries of that instant. Not written in ink, but in posture, in placement, in the way the jaw hung open, in the tilt of the cranium toward the one beside it. In Pompeii, many bodies were preserved by the ash itself, forming voids in the hardened layers. Later, plaster was poured into these spaces, revealing faces mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-face.
Beside pets, skulls behind locked doors. In these moments, humanity was not grand. It was intimate. The skulls did not belong to emperors or generals. They belonged to bakers, to scribes, to lovers, to the ones history often forgets, but who in this moment were preserved more fully than any name carved in marble. The heat of the pyroclastic surge, nearly 500 degrees Celsius, was enough to cause skulls to burst from within. Some bore evidence of that force, others fractured gently over centuries, the ash pressing in like slow snow. And still they told stories. Stories of where someone stood, of where they ran, of who they tried to protect. At Atlantis, the skull of a young woman was found wearing gold earrings.
a delicate circlet of wealth in a moment of ruin. Near her, the skull of another, perhaps a servant, still reaching for her hand. Each skull a frame, each frame a film, paused forever. And while we cannot know what thoughts flickered through those final moments, we do know they were thinking, because the skull was shaped to hold not just instinct, but imagination. Even in fear, perhaps they remembered the warmth of a meal, the sound of laughter, the feel of a child's breath on their shoulder. These memories are lost now, but the bone remains, and bone, as we've learned, remembers shape. Tonight, as you lie safely in your room, wrapped in silence not of ash but of rest, think of those who lay down without knowing they would never rise again. Not soldiers, not saints, just people. And yet, their skulls speak. Of how ordinary life is worth preserving. Of how every head once held a world. Of how love, even at the end, curls inward. The children beneath the ash did not choose to be remembered, but they were. Not as myth, not as marble, but as truth, sealed in time. And in their quiet, we learn how fragile and how eternal a single day can be. Once, to learn the secrets of a skull, we had to touch it, to lift it from the ground, clean it with brushes, feel the ridges with cautious fingers, to saw it open sometimes or cast it in plaster, to break it often in the act of trying to see. But now, we use light. In quiet rooms filled with soft hums and screens, skulls rest on padded tables beneath the arms of machines. No cutting, no scraping, just light, wrapped in mathematics. The CT scanner has become our gentlest archaeologist. It passes rays through the bone in delicate slices, capturing layer by layer, detail by detail, the interior of a cranium once filled with thought. With it, we see what fingers never could: the curve of an inner wall, the thickness of bone where the jaw clenched tight, the faint line of a childhood illness long since healed.
The brain, not as guesswork, but with precision. And in that space, we find presence. It's like shining a lantern into a room that hasn't been lit in thousands of years. Not to disturb, only to understand. At the Max Planck Institute, at museums in London, in Kenya, in Beijing, in Paris, scans are made of the world's most ancient skulls. Digital ghosts of real bone, spinning on screens, floating in space. They can be enlarged, rotated, studied, without ever lifting the original from its cradle. In this way, we become time travelers, but gentle ones. We do not step back through violence. We step back through light. CT scanning reveals not just size, but story. In a Neanderthal skull from Shanidar Cave, it showed a healed fracture above the eye, a wound from childhood, perhaps from a fall. The bone had fused unevenly, yet the individual lived long afterward, meaning someone cared for them. In an ancient Homo erectus skull from Georgia, scanning revealed a missing row of teeth, gone long before death, meaning someone chewed food for them. And in a young child's skull from Egypt, the scan showed signs of anemia, small hollows at the top of the eye sockets, and perhaps the echo of a life too short. Not from violence, but from something slower, more human. This is what technology gives us. Not just data, but compassion. The ability to look inside without harm, to learn without loss. We can reconstruct ancient faces with startling accuracy, from the inside out. From the hollow of the cranium outward to cheek and chin, eyelid and brow. We do not guess anymore. We build from evidence. And with every scan, we breathe life into memory. The skull becomes not a symbol of death, but a canvas for possibility.
Even DNA is sometimes drawn from bone, teased from within the petrous part of the temporal bone, the hardest, most protected place. There, in that quiet corner of the skull, ancestral stories still sleep, waiting to be read. We are careful now. We know what has been lost through haste, through arrogance, through destruction. So we map slowly. We listen before we lift. We scan before we speak. Because these skulls, ancient, delicate, are not puzzles to solve. They are people to remember. And the scanner does not forget. It holds the image forever, stored on hard drives, printed on paper, projected in classrooms where new minds learn from old ones. Skulls that once lay in the dark are now beacons, lit from within by beings we cannot see, yet trust. It is a strange kind of kindness, to offer light to the long dead, to hold them without fingers.
Stories have beginnings, or so we're told.
A starting point, a first step. A moment when the light flicks on and says, "Here, this is where it all began." But sometimes a story surprises even its teller. Sometimes the beginning is not where we thought it was, and a single discovery, dusty, silent, sleeping in stone, can shift everything we thought we knew. Such was the case at Jebel Irhoud, in the broad, sunburnt hills of Morocco. What seemed at first like a collection of scattered fossils, fragments of bone long overlooked, became something far more extraordinary. A skull, then another, then tools, then the quiet realization that this site held something old, older than it should have been. In 2017, after decades of excavation and new, careful dating, scientists announced it. These skulls were not 100,000 or even 200,000 years old. They were over 300,000 years old. And not just old, modern. The faces they belonged to looked like ours. Wide cheekbones, flattened faces, high foreheads. Homo sapiens. Not completely, not yet, but close enough to recognize. Close enough to whisper, "You belong to us." Until then, we believed that modern humans had emerged in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, and then spread outward. But the skulls at Jebel Irhoud changed that. They suggested a different beginning. Not a single birthplace, but a continent-wide awakening. Not a tree with one trunk, but a braid. The skulls rewrote our timeline. They peeled back the first chapter of what it means to be human, and in doing so, they reminded us, history is not finished. It is still unfolding. The bones found at Jebel Irhoud, jaw fragments, skull caps, teeth, were studied with reverence, scanned, modeled, measured, and in their shapes, something quiet and powerful emerged. The brain cases were not fully modern. The rear of the skull was elongated, not the round, globular form of today. But the face, oh, the face, was astonishingly familiar. As if someone we once knew had stepped forward through the dust, eyes open, mouth just beginning to form words. And those words might have been, "We were here earlier than you thought. We were you in pieces. We were the beginning you almost didn't find." The tools discovered nearby were also striking. Stone flakes, carefully worked. Signs of hunting, of cooking, of gathering by firelight. Not brute survival, organization, intention. It meant that thinking, feeling, and planning minds walked those Moroccan hills long before we thought they could. That modernity was not a spark, but a slow burn, a process, a dawn, the final word. But it is a reminder that the first words are always harder to hear, buried deep, almost forgotten. and brought back into light. And the skull, weathered, partial, aching with age, became not just a fossil, but a messenger. It told us to look wider, to ask again, to loosen the grip of certainty. Science does not thrive on answers. It thrives on correction, on surprise, on humility. And so, we adjusted the timeline. We pushed the origin of Homo sapiens back by 100,000 years. We redrew maps, we rewrote textbooks, and we whispered with wonder. We were wrong, and that's beautiful. Because what better gift than to learn we are older than we thought, that our roots run deeper, that our first thoughts were spoken in more than one accent, beside more than one river. Tonight, as you rest your head, remember the skull from Jebel Irhoud, lying for hundreds of millennia in silence, waiting for someone to listen. It did not shout. It did not boast. It only existed, and that, in the end, was enough to change everything. Run your fingers over your brow. Press your fingertips to the soft hollows at your temples. Feel the quiet curve above your ears, the subtle ridge at the back of your head. This is your skull, ancient, familiar, sacred. And though you may never see it, you have carried it with you every hour of your life. It holds not just your brain, but your being. It protects the place where your laughter begins, where memories are stored in tiny flashes, where you dream without knowing how. But more than that, your skull carries something older. It carries the shape of your ancestors, hundreds of them, thousands more. You do not know their names, but they are there. In the width of your forehead, in the depth of your eye sockets, in the gentle slope of bone that follows your thoughts wherever they go. You are not just one person, you are a vessel. You hold the accumulated decisions of everyone who came before you. The ones who hunted in snow, the ones who crossed deserts barefoot, the ones who huddled beneath branches as rain drummed on leaves, the ones who dared to imagine something more than hunger, more than fear. And you are also a witness to this moment, to this breath, to this night. The skull you wear is not decoration. It is record of your mother's labor, of your first fall, of the headaches you never understood, of the language you learned before you even had words. Inside your skull, a silent dialogue continues. The hemispheres of the same silence you carry when you bow your head, when you close your eyes, when you hold your breath in awe or sorrow or joy. Even as you grow, your skull is growing with you. From infancy to adolescence, its plates fuse, its hollows deepen. It responds to stress, to light, to song. It holds not just the mind, but the experience of having a mind. It is not passive. It is not cold. It is alive, in its own way. Not with thought, but with shape. Not with desire, but with memory. The same ridges that once cradled the thoughts of a child in Tong, the same curves that held the minds of those who walked out of Africa, the same bowl that carried the dreaming of early humans under painted caves. They are with you, now, right here, beneath your skin. The skull beneath your face is not only yours, it is a chorus of inheritance. It is a whisper of those who lived and died and lived again through you. And as you lie down tonight, resting your head against the softness of the pillow, you are not laying down alone. You are laying down with history, with everyone who held their child the way you were held, with everyone who looked to the stars in wonder, with everyone who feared the dark and then made fire to push it back. This is your skull, but it is also theirs. And in that knowing, you are held in structure, in silence, in sacred, unseen geometry. So let your brow soften, let your breath slow, and feel, just for a moment, the quiet beneath your skin. Not empty, not forgotten, but eternal. Somewhere, behind hushed doors and temperature-controlled halls, skulls rest in quiet rows. They sit beneath soft lighting, tucked into glass cases, angled just so. Tiny plaques tell their names, or what names we've given them. Homo habilis, Cro-Magnon, La Chapelle aux Saints. Specimen codes, dates, discovery sites. It is easy to walk past them without pausing, easy to see them as exhibits, fragments, evidence, bone beneath labels. But if you stand still, long enough, if you listen carefully, you'll hear something. Not a voice, not a warning, but a hum. Not with death, but with the echo of once having lived. Because these skulls, displayed in rows, did not always belong to museums. They once belonged to people. To a woman who laughed by a fire. To a boy who chased something across a misshapen, bearing the scars of illness, of war, of strange ritual. Each one a story told in silence. They rest not in coffins, but in context. Next to tools, next to cave maps, next to artist reconstructions of faces they once wore. But no sculpture can hold what the skull held. A skull held the whole world once. It felt every smile. It absorbed every loss. It shaped to fit a growing brain, full of memory, language, hope, fear. Now that brain is long gone, but the shape remains. And shape, as we've seen, remembers. In that museum, wherever it is, a child might press their forehead to the glass, looking in, trying to understand, trying to hear the hum. They might not know how to read the label, but they will recognize the shape, because we are built to recognize faces. And the skull, even bare, still holds the trace of a face. In that moment, something passes between them, the living and the long dead. Not knowledge, but recognition. A soft remembering that this skull once was someone, and that someone was not so different. We often think museums are about what we know, but some of the most powerful rooms are those that hold what we don't, the forgotten thoughts, the ones that left no mark in clay, no scratch on stone, no word in air, but that once existed, fully, fiercely, and completely, inside the walls of that skull. That is what makes these halls sacred. Not the glass, not the labels, but the presence of a life that once was. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, imagine walking through such a room. Slow footsteps, dim light, the air still as if listening. And there, to your left, a skull, perhaps broken, perhaps whole. It is not just bone, it is history's breath, paused. And if you close your eyes beside it, just for a moment, you might feel what it once felt. Curiosity, longing, the hush of sleep beneath stars. You are not separate from the skulls in the glass. You are only further along the corridor. And someday, someone may stand where you are now, looking back, gently, quietly, and remembering you. A mixtication of sense. The skull is not just a relic, not a fossil to catalogue, not a trophy of history or a curiosity sealed behind glass. It is a storyteller, a keeper of storms and songs, a vessel of breath long vanished and yet, somehow, still speaking. It does not speak in words, it speaks in shape. In the arch of the brow, we read the burdens once carried. In the wear of the teeth, we glimpse the kind of food chewed, the kind of work done, to be heard. Some skulls are incomplete. A jawbone here, a piece of frontal bone there. Fragments. But even these slivers speak. A single molar can whisper of migration. A nasal bridge can suggest ancestry. The ridged roof of a mouth can hint at the echo of speech once spoken. And when archaeologists, anatomists, and artists begin to piece those fragments together, gently, reverently, something remarkable happens. Bone becomes story. At first, it's technical. Scans and reconstructions, comparisons, models. But then the story deepens. The shape becomes a face. The face becomes a life. And the life becomes a bridge between the long ago and the right now. We begin to ask questions. What did they see when they looked up at the sky? What did they believe would happen after death? Did they hum lullabies? Did they laugh in the same rhythm we do? Did they ache when someone was gone? The skull cannot answer all of this, but it invites us to wonder. And wonder, when gentle, is the beginning of truth. We do not need names to know that someone was loved. We do not need writing to know that someone hoped. We do not need stone monuments to know that someone mattered. The skull is enough. Even broken, even buried, even burned, it carries what matters. And as we kneel beside the earth, brush dust from cheekbones, lift a piece of the past into the light, we are not studying strangers. We are looking into mirrors made of time. Because every skull we find speaks of us too, of how we bend, how we break, how we adapt and survive and grieve and dream. And this is why we return to the dig sites, to the caves, to the ancient riverbeds, not just to uncover bones, but to uncover ourselves. When bone becomes story, it teaches us that we are not alone, that we were never alone. It reminds us that we were shaped not just by genes, but by generations, not just by evolution, but by emotion. Each skull is a verse in a long poem, not a heroic epic, but something quieter, a lullaby hummed across millennia, a prayer written in marrow, a whisper passed down, not by voice, but by form. And when we listen to that whisper, when we gather the skulls with care, when we study them without arrogance, when we hold their stories with respect, we find something deep and still inside ourselves, belonging to a species, to a lineage, to a story so long it cannot be told in one lifetime, but only felt. Tonight, as your breath slows and your thoughts grow soft, remember this. The shape of your own skin, and beneath your skin, behind your eyes, within the quiet architecture of your body, is a skull. Your skull. Not something you hold, but something that holds you. Bone wrapped in skin and memory. A curved shell that has kept your dreams safe since the moment you began. It is yours, utterly, intimately, and yet it is not only yours. Because your skull is not new. It is a continuation. a culmination of 1,000 others who came before you, who braved the cold, who crossed rivers, who wept when firelight flickered low, who held their children and feared the dark and imagined stars. Their thoughts no longer echo in language, but they remain in shape, in the slope of your forehead, the curve of your jaw, the space inside your mind where love lives quietly beside fear. You are not alone in the dark. You sleep beside your ancestors, not in presence, but in pattern. They are in the way your head fits the pillow, in the way your mind drifts toward stories, in the way your breath slows when safety surrounds you. Every night you place your skull, your most fragile, most sacred part, in trust. You let it rest, you let it dream, you let it forget the weight of the day. And this, too, is ancient. The child in Tong once lay still in dusk. The Neanderthal in Shanidar once curled beside fire. The mother in Herculaneum held her child in a final hushed moment of sleep. The skulls we now display once knew rest, just as you do now. They held futures, just as yours does. Inside your skull, new thoughts bloom. Plans not yet spoken, names not yet known, moments not yet lived. Your fears are not the first. Your hopes are not the last. And your dreams, though they feel fragile, are part of something enduring. This is not just a head resting on a pillow. This is history in motion, a life continuing, a story not yet complete. So sleep with reverence, not fear, not sadness, but quiet honor. You carry more than memory. You carry the architecture of becoming. And when you wake, your skull will wake with you, ready to hold another day, ready to listen, ready to carry the thoughts only you can shape. Let the pillow cradle you, let the night wrap you, and let the silence beneath your skin become soft and steady once more. The skull you sleep beside is not separate. It is you, and it remembers more than you know.